all we want people to know is that we care, we love them, and that we just want to be a part of their lives. And the things that we believe about Jesus and the way that Jesus works in our lives are things that we just want them to know too, because we found them to be life-giving for us. That's the gospel, right? I mean, that's ultimately what we're trying to communicate to people and why we have these conversations in the first place.
Hello and welcome to More Than Sunday, a weekly podcast where we take a deeper dive into the stories, themes, and questions of our faith. My name is Julie Richter, and I'm the lead pastor to Access, our modern worship community at First United Methodist Church, Richardson. And with me every week is Eric Czechowski, our worship director. How's it going?
It's going great. How are you?
It's good. So we get to talk about something today that we say at the very beginning of the podcast every single week. Right after I say hello, I say this word: welcome. In January, at the very beginning of this year, Access set out with 3 goals for the year. One was to have deeper faith engagement. One was to be the church that Richardson needs. And the final goal was to be a place that was radically invitational and radically welcoming. And so we want to talk today about what that looks like. And this is going to be a conversation that just Eric and I are going to have. And we want to dive into, how do we invite our friends? How do we invite strangers? How do we create a culture of invitation? And then once people are here, how do we make them feel welcome? How do we create an experience, a place that maybe feels like home?
I think so often we fail to see the importance of this work and the intentionality behind it. Last week, Misty reminded us, even in her work with kids, that kids often aren't postured, we use that term postured, to receive knowledge, receive information, or be taught until they feel a connection, until a relationship is built, until trust is built, and really until they feel like they're cared about. There's a great quote from Maya Angelou, and others have probably said it as well, that people don't care how much we know until they know how much we care. And so until we do that work of really building community and making people feel at home, making people feel welcome, they probably aren't apt to be vulnerable in a new community, be vulnerable in a new church, or anywhere else for that matter.
And this is maybe one of the most important things we can talk about, as Eric mentioned earlier, but it is also maybe one of the hardest things to do, because many of us don't want to admit that we struggle to go beyond polite. We struggle to actually make new friends. I remember when I was in college, you show up and everyone is new, and so it's easy to make friends. Nobody told me that when you moved again and started your first job, that making friends the second time, coming into a place where everyone else already knows each other, is a lot more difficult. And so when you're the person that's already in that system or in that place and someone else new walks in, putting yourself in those shoes and trying to figure out how to make them feel welcome is not as easy as it sounds.
You know, one of the best experiences that I had in sort of opening my eyes to some of this in the church, especially those of us who work in the church or those of us who have been in the church for a long time, sort of become, you know, those TV commercials, the Febreze commercials, the nose blind commercials?
Oh,
like
yeah.
We've sort of become nose blind to what a visitor might experience, because we've been entrenched in the system for so long, and we have our people and we have our cliques. And whether we think they're cliquey or not, cliques are a natural human tendency that we really have to intentionally rebel against. Otherwise, they just sort of naturally happen, right? We flock toward people that are like-minded. We flock toward people that are similar personalities. We flock toward people who maybe are in similar stages of life. And that can be a real barrier for people to break into when they're walking into a new church. And so one of the greatest experiences that I had was a time where I actually wasn't working in a church. My wife and I were living in Nashville at the time and had a unique opportunity in our lives to church shop, which is sort of the term, right? Mm-hmm. That we had an opportunity to go see what churches were out there and experience a few different ones. And so the first church that we went to was a church very much like First United Methodist Richardson. It was was a large church, beautiful expressions of worship, beautiful music direction, a lot of intentionality into flow, and the preaching was dynamic and so many things that were really great. But as is so often the case, and one of the things that as a larger institution we have to be aware of, it was very easy for Val and I to slip in and slip out unnoticed, right? So big church, great morning of worship, but we slipped in and slipped out and thought, well, that was nice. Maybe we'll come back sometime, right? We tried another church the following week, sort of a small to medium-sized church. It was a lovely church, but there was nothing that particularly drew us back. And so the third week we tried yet another church, and this was another small to medium church. But what was different about this church was the way that very organically we felt radically welcomed. And none of these things are rocket science, right? Let me throw that out there at the very beginning. This is sort of welcoming 101, right? There was somebody waiting at the outside door there to open the door for us. It was a small enough church that he sort of identified us as somebody that he didn't know. And it wasn't like 10 people were there, right? I mean, there were probably 200 people in worship, but he identified us as somebody he didn't know, introduced himself, said, are you guys visiting or have I just not met you yet?
Oh, that's a good way to say that.
Yeah. And so we said, no, it's actually our first time. And he asked just a little bit about us, and we were engaged at the time. So he walked us just a few steps into the door to introduce us to somebody who was standing at the entrance to the sanctuary in the narthex area. But it was a very organic pass-off. It didn't seem forced. It didn't seem anything. But it also seemed intentional. And maybe it was, and maybe it was just kind of the Holy Spirit working in that moment, but passed us off to somebody who handed us a bulletin. He had introduced us as first-time visitors. And then from there, they walked us into the sanctuary, and this was the key part. Sat us down next to a couple, introduced us to that couple, and I'll never forget it. It was Harlan and Francis. They were twice our age. They were empty nesters, different phase of life. You'd think, well, we probably don't have much in common, except they just cared that we were there, right? And they just opened up a conversation. And Harlan owned a shoe store in town, and we talked about his shoe store, and they asked about us, and we talked about the music work that I was doing and that Val was looking for a teaching job. And we just had this really beautiful organic connection that wouldn't have happened if we hadn't been sort of intentionally passed off there. Worship was lovely, but really where we found the connection was in the people. We were invited to Sunday school right after that. We went to one Sunday school class, and we stayed for the rest of our time in Nashville. And that was the church that we chose. It was the church, honestly, of the three that seemed to put less resources into sort of the pomp, circumstance, and flash of worship, right? But it just felt like home.
Yeah.
It just felt like home. And so we never left until we moved back to Dallas. That was our church.
Yeah. So I want to break down some of those steps and talk through what that looked like in terms of your experience. Because I think you're right that we can't be a smaller church, but we can feel like a smaller church. And, you know, some of the things that when you walk onto the campus at First Methodist Richardson, we're just a very large campus. And so parking can be overwhelming. Finding your way around to the children's area or the youth area, or even to our worship and art center where we have access, can be very difficult. And so from the parking lot to inside the doors, I love that idea of sort of a baton pass off. And it doesn't even have to be somebody that looks like you or that's in the same age demographic as you are, but somebody that can connect with you. And so there's just some really simple things that I think that we can learn from that story in terms of welcoming. But I think the most important thing is that there was not a single person in that story, and probably not in that congregation that called it home, that didn't feel like it was their responsibility to be that welcoming person. And I think that that's what we have to do as a congregation, is we have to see that it's not just the staff's job or select volunteers of greeters or ushers. It is every person's job in the church to be welcoming in the same way that we hope they were welcomed in the doors of the church.
Well, and much like we hopefully are proud of the places that we live, you talked a little bit on Sunday, Julie, about ways that we welcome people into our homes,
right.
or maybe if we don't like to sort of play host, maybe ways that we feel like we are welcomed well into other people's homes or into other institutions or into restaurants. You brought up, think about your favorite restaurant or your favorite place to go. What are some of the things that they do that just make it feel inviting, that make it feel comfortable? I think one of those things is having some ownership and maybe even a little bit of pride about your community and about your church, right? To say, I love my church. And it's something that you want to share with people you know because it's been life-giving for you.
Yeah, it's something that you want to talk about. And I think that's the connection between inviting and welcoming, is that when we are welcomed well, we're more likely to invite well. And when we're invited well, what we hope happens for the person who is given the invitation is that they are welcomed well when they walk through the doors of the church. So in terms of inviting and welcoming, I think a definition of hospitality might be fitting here, because I think hospitality involves both the invitation and welcoming. So the idea of hospitality is actually a Greek concept, a concept that was actually sacred. And so if you break down that word hospitality, it's the word hostis, which means stranger. It also has the word hostile in it, which means enemy. The word polis, which means power. And so if you put those words together, it's a stranger or an enemy with power. But there's this extra part in the word hostir, which means to equalize, to be on level ground. And so what hospitality essentially is the great equalizer. It creates a level ground for the stranger or maybe even the enemy. And so when you are inviting or welcoming someone, what we are doing is we are evening the playing field. We are saying that we don't want it to be about power structures or about accomplishment or success. We want it just to be about our common humanity and a person walking in wanting the same sort of human connection that I desire. And I think so often, whether we realize we're doing it or not, we are inhibiting each other from one another. We are reluctant of that connection. We are maybe even afraid of that connection because we're either hesitant because we don't do it well, or we're hesitant because we don't know that person well and we don't know if it's going to be a good conversation. And so that's something that we encourage those who are in our church to work on getting better at. I think it's something that we could each work to get better at. Eric and I both have shared in moments of honesty that welcoming and having conversations with people who are new is sometimes difficult. But I think that it takes discipline and I think it takes practice. We assume that this should be easy or should come naturally. And the reality is that sometimes it doesn't. And so we have to go the extra step to be radically welcoming.
And that's such an important point. If you feel like welcoming or being sort of that outgoing presence on Sunday morning is very unnatural for you, I hope you hear that you're in good company. And Julie and I are part of that company, right? We have heard a number of times from a number of folks in our community that have talked about how transformational the discipline of sort of forcing themselves to be extroverts in the moment and really use some of these intentional disciplines to reach out to people. They've had people in their lives talk about not only how it seems they're welcoming folks, but how it transforms them and just has some really positive fruits just in their own self-confidence and in the ways that they interact with people. And so I hope you hear that as an encouragement to be willing to sort of step outside yourself and give it a shot.
So recognize in all of that you are not alone. You're not the only one who feels uncomfortable. You're not the only one who feels like maybe you're not the best at doing this. That doesn't make us any less called or encouraged to be that person. So one of the ways that we do that in Access that we have started implementing this last year that I'm so proud of and I hope that is something that you can maybe take on organically too is we've started these things called pew neighborhoods. If you normally sit by people every single week in your service, maybe spread out a little. So you can still sit in your pew, but instead of that sort
or
of...
chair, as the case may be.
Right, or chair, yeah, as it is in Access. You know, and sometimes we get so stuck in sitting like, this is my seat, this is my row, this is where I do worship. And I think that we can maybe enhance that. Instead of telling you to move somewhere else in the sanctuary or in the Worship and Arts Center, maybe just scoot out a little bit. And every week, somebody who sits in your section, maybe those 2 to 3 rows, those are the people that are in your pew neighborhood. And so reaching out to the person who comes and sits in that area, or having a group of people who go to lunch after. And so the person that came and sat in that section is reached out to and invited into that pew family. But I love that idea of a pew family, that you're not just doing it alone. It's not just one person's job, but an entire group of people who can share in connection together and also check on you when you haven't been there in a while. So taking that extra step to not only be welcoming, but to actually make connection with one another.
And I think that does 2 really beautiful things. Number one, it reminds us that it's not ours to be welcoming to the whole room. I mean, we can't possibly
meet every single person.
400 people or 600 people or 100 people on a Sunday,
sure,
right? But it allows us to sort of take what's ours to take and really focus in on those 20 or 30 people that might be in our immediate vicinity and be in a smaller sort of community with them. And then on a systematic scale, the great thing about that, it can be so hard, and I referenced it earlier in my story, it can be so difficult for a large organization to feel small. One of the biggest knocks against big churches in particular is, well, how could you possibly know anyone at that church because there's 3,000 people there on a Sunday morning, right? Well, the way that big churches, big organizations, big companies feel small is they split into smaller sections. They split into smaller groups. They split into pew families. They split into discipleship groups so that you have a very small, tight-knit community within the large body that may come together to worship or to do mission. But you've got this tight-knit community that cares for each other, loves each other, lives with each other, does life together. And that is what the church should be about.
It's what ultimately will keep you coming back.
That's right. That's right. So I was made aware of an article recently that I think is a large company that does this really well. Five Guys Burgers, that many of us are probably aware of, that was just started by a guy and his family who just really wanted to make good burgers. And according to this article, they've intentionally taken money that would traditionally in a company of that size be used for external marketing, and instead they put it into secret shoppers. And the reason for that is because they want to check up on their small local stores to make sure that the experience that people are having in a store that might seat 80 people is warm, welcoming, the food's good, the service is good, the facilities are clean, because they believe that more so than any billboard, any TV commercial, any print ad, any social media stuff, people are going to come to Five Guys because the burgers are good and the experience is warm.
So you've made me hungry, first of all. Now I need to go get a burger. But I think this is a great segue into talking about invitation and how to be invitational. And I think that you're right, that this idea of word of mouth is actually more impactful, and marketing and public relations will tell you the same thing. There's probably nothing better and nothing more impactful than word of mouth. So you can see it 5 different places or 10 different places in magazines or billboards or commercials, but until somebody else says to you, hey, you've got to check this out, that's probably going to be the key to actually getting you there. And this is not a new concept. This is scriptural. All the way back in the book of Acts, when the early churches started, the word of Jesus begins to spread and the apostles are spreading it. And one of my favorite scriptures talks about how they were surprised at how many people were drawn to Jesus and drawn to this message of Christ, as if they didn't even expect their own word of mouth, like what was coming out of their mouth to do anything. But what we believe in the church and what we believe in our own faith is that we're not alone in that we have the Spirit who's an advocate, as the scripture says, to give us that encouragement to talk about our church and to talk about our faith. And it doesn't have to be some scary or overwhelming idea. I think we have some negative connotations around that word evangelism.
The E word.
Yeah, the E word, evangelism, about, that like somebody's going to come up to us on the street and go, do you know Jesus? I'm not asking for you or for anyone else to do it in that particular way, one that may be shameful or frustrating, but in the same way that I can't help but talk about a great podcast or a great movie or a great TV show or a really great football game, I want my church to be a place that I just can't help but talk about.
So we've talked a little bit about why we invite. I think the difficult thing for a lot of us is probably how we invite. Religion is sort of that thing like politics at the dinner table that maybe you don't talk about, right? So how do we invite? At annual conference 2 years ago that we hosted in our church, Matt Miofsky was here. He's a pastor in St. Louis in the United Methodist Church, and he talked a lot about the invitation and welcoming components, but he was really encouraging in the sense of more people than we might believe would actually come to a Sunday morning worship service with you if you just ask them.
Right.
Like, I think we're so terrified to just say, hey, do you want to come to church on Sunday?
Right.
Like, that's a fairly non-threatening, because what's the worst they can say? Nah, I'm good. Right? I mean, and so he was sort of encouraging to say, we sort of project on people the worst thing that they could say, or the worst way that it could affect our relationship, or the worst thing about just asking, hey, do you want to come to church on Sunday?
Mm-hmm.
Or, hey, do you want to come to a concert on Sunday night at my church? Or, hey, my church has a movie night. Do you want to, right? I mean,
right. Well, and that's the great thing I think about our church, and it's not just our church, but I think our church has a lot of really non-threatening entry points besides Sunday morning. A couple of weeks ago, we just had Trunk or Treat, right? Which was a huge community event. It's so non-threatening to come and dress up in costume and hand out candy and just get to know people in our community. And especially because Halloween this year was rainy on Wednesday night, it was a great opportunity the week before for our parents and our kids to come out and take part in that. And so it doesn't always have to be an invitation to worship or an invitation. I think we have this, what I would call old school model of like inviting your friend to the revival. It doesn't have to be high stakes. It really can just be about connection. And you can maybe let God work from there.
Yeah, and the great thing about that is hopefully there is sort of a trajectory then that maybe through some conviction from God working in their hearts and working through you, that sort of might take them along a path, right? I mean, Arthur Jones, we had him on the podcast months and months ago, and he talked about the steps that you can take. You want to go to Trunk or Treat? Great. Maybe then come to Sunday morning worship. You want to come to Sunday morning worship? Great. Maybe then get in a small group. You want to get in a small group? Great. Maybe then consider giving, right? I mean, there's like this sort of discipleship trajectory that the hope is that we're engaging people into. But yeah, Julie, you're totally right. I mean, sometimes it can be such a non-threatening, low-stakes opportunity that we just invite folks to be a part of the community.
Right.
And that goes right back to what we said at the very beginning. All we want people to know is that we care, we love them, and that we just want to be a part of their lives. And the things that we believe about Jesus and the way that Jesus works in our lives are things that we just want them to know too.
Sure.
Because we've found them to be life-giving for us. Like, that's the gospel, right? I mean,
Right.
That's ultimately what we're trying to communicate to people and why we have these conversations in the first place.
And I think that there's two different sorts of invitations. I mean, and we're talking about both of them now. You're talking about the invitation to the person that you know, so the person that's a friend or the person you work with or the family member. And then you're talking about the invitation to the person that you've maybe just met or that you don't know at all. And so, of course, those invitations are going to look different. But I think what is common between both of them is that you have to form the relationship.
That's right.
So whether it is a relationship that you've had for a long time and is important to you, you know, inviting that person to church is not a threat to that relationship. It doesn't have to be a threat. And the same thing for the person that you maybe don't know as well. Being caring, being vulnerable, being Christ to them in whatever way, loving, giving, grace-filled in those relationships is more of a testament to our faith than even the invitation itself. And so sometimes when we invite people and we do it out of a place of shame, yeah, that's not going to work well. But if we continue to foster those relationships and give to those relationships, then the invitation is not as threatening.
And I think when we talked in an early sermon series this year about the membership vows that we take, prayers, presence, gift, service, and witness. And the important part of witness, I think, in the invitation process, I think so often there's an opportunity for somebody to look at somebody who's witnessing well for Jesus, who's representing, we talk about Jesus well in the world, and go, man, I want some of what they have. And sometimes the hard work of sort of introducing Jesus to them is done because they see the way that Jesus is made manifest in the way that we live, hopefully. I mean, that's the hope, right?
Right.
But that's the whole point of that witness is they can see Jesus coming out of people, and they go, man, I want some of that. Like, what? Like, tell me what it is about your life that has given you this joy and given you this confidence. And when we see the light of Christ really exuding from people, I think that does a lot of the hard work for us. And then all we have to say is, man, it's just my church and it's Jesus. And I'd love for you to come sometime.
Absolutely. So we've talked about the why of invitation, even the how of invitation. We want to close today by talking about who. Who do we invite? And Clayton, our senior pastor, preached last week about this invitation and about who we invite to church, to the table. And I think his story says it best.
You know, one of my favorite stories about the building of this sanctuary is the story about this communion rail, because this chancel area, when the first designs came in, this chancel area was very small. It was very small, and what we did, everything was a lot more compact up here, and the communion rail was right up. Terry knows. Terry was chair of the building committee. I mean, it was really tight, and so we kept saying, the whole thing needs to be wider. It needs to be larger, wider. We kept pushing out, and as we're pushing it out, the architect said, "Well, how wide?" We said, "It's got to be wide." I mean, this is a church that believes that everybody's welcome at the table, and we got to get everybody to the table, and so we kept pushing it. So we pushed it all the way. I mean, look at those rails; they go all the way, almost to the end of the room, and it's this wide. And the architect was sitting there. He says, "Well, how wide do you want it?" And one of our building committee members said, "Always needs to be wide enough for one more." And that to me is this church. That's who God has put us here to be. The church that always has room for one more.
We are and always have been proud of the way that First United Methodist Richardson welcomes and invites people. But I think it's only when we do it through that mindset of always having room for one more that we're effective in building that trust, in building those relationships, in welcoming people on behalf of Jesus.
Today we want to leave you with a scripture from Romans 15 that talks about the way in which we are called to be towards each other, the love and the grace that we are called to have towards each other that may help us to invite and to welcome. This is from Romans chapter 15, verses 5 through 7. May the God who gives endurance and encouragement give you the same attitude of mind toward each other that Christ Jesus had, so that with one mind and one voice you may glorify the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. Accept one another, then just as Christ accepted you, in order to bring praise to God.
Thank you so much for tuning into this episode of More Than Sunday. If you like the podcast, please feel free to share it, go online and leave a comment, or give us a rating so that others might hear about us. We've got a new episode coming out every Wednesday, so make sure you also subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, or on YouTube so you don't miss our next episode. If you want to find out more about the Access community here at First United Methodist Church Richardson, you can find us online at accessfumcr.com, as well as on Facebook and Instagram. Make sure you tune in next Wednesday when we continue the conversation around invitation and welcoming. Have a great week.